Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I'm Jamie Moeller, and this is the Grad Connection, where the whole point of these videos is to help graduate students do more than just survive, but see thrive. So last week I started talking about scripts that work, and I said that I was going to kind of talk through these sets. I had talked about the awareness wheel at one point, or the conflict communication wheel. Last week I talked about disagreeing agreeably, and several people commented on that and found it useful, so that's great. I would encourage you, in all of these videos, I'm kind of giving you a snippet from the source. I'm giving it through my lens, as I've kind of integrated it into my thinking and so forth, and kind of my take on it. But I would encourage you, these sources that I'm providing, whether they be videos online or whether they be books or whatever, you're going to get a whole lot more out of them, probably than I am, because you're basically getting a distilled version through my lens, or the things that stand out to me. And oftentimes, what I found is, oftentimes when I hear somebody else talk about something, a book or some other source, it's not to say that what they're saying is not true about that particular source or whatever, but it's their take on it, right? It's through their lens or through their thinking. And so I find it valuable to always, even if somebody gives me a reference, is to go back to the original source material, and also just to give credit to where this stuff comes from. But I guess to some degree, I kind of feel like I'm a connector. That is, I'm connecting content from lots of different places, and trying to distill it. But I guess to some degree, that's what we all do. So today, what I really want to talk about is this. It's surrounding this book called The Coaching Habit. So I don't know Michael Stanier, but I picked this book up. And I found it very useful because it uses this script idea. So that's kind of what I want to talk about it today. I do know and I'll be honest and say I haven't completely finished it. And I will also say he has a new book out. I think it's called The Advice Monster or something like that. But essentially, the whole premise of this book is when you're working with teams, and particularly when you're the lead of a team, is trying to get out of the habit of trying to solve everybody's problems and give everybody the answer. It's taking more of a coaching approach to working with folks that you work with. Now, honestly, you could turn this around and use it on your boss. You could use it on your kids. You could use it on a spouse. You could use it on whatever, as a way to kind of coach and guide rather than to tell somebody something, and I think people get a whole lot more out of it. Now, the reality is, taking this coaching approach is slower. And I think oftentimes we jump right to the solution and tell people exactly what to do simply because we either don't have the time or can't make the time to kind of take more of a conversational approach that leads or coaches the individual. But nevertheless, I found this book very useful. It's actually a very I like the style that it's written in. Very conversational. There's a lot of material on the website, the company that he owns, Box of Crayons. There's a lot of material there, the videos that it references. You could probably read this, very quickly if you wanted to. But oftentimes, again, my approach to reading business books is to take it from the standpoint of, I pick it up, I read it until something strikes a chord with me, until I discover some nugget that applies to me. Call it revelation, call it discovery, call it whatever you want to, but essentially, I read until something strikes a chord with me, and then I stop. Because once I get to that point, it's like there's only so many things that I can integrate in my life at any particular time. And so I take that one nugget, I walk away with it, and I basically mull over it, and I generally try to teach it, right? So part of me teaching is doing what I'm doing right here. But you could do this with a colleague. Originally, when I started what I called the discipline way back, the very first videos, you can go back and look at that. But when I started the discipline, essentially what I would do is would relay it to folks that I work with. I'd try to find some way to teach it to someone else, because essentially, again, all of this material is useless if you're not integrated into your life, if you're not finding a way to use it, and it takes work to do that. It doesn't just automatically happen. And so doing a discovery approach, and like I said, you could read this very quickly, but there's a lot of nuggets in here that you could basically hone out and chew on, right? And I really like his approach, more of an interactive training approach as opposed to kind of a passive approach. So that's also a good thing. So anyway, that's kind of the book, and I'm not, and I will put a link to the book in the show notes down there in the YouTube comments, or in the comments, because I'm going to take a little bit different approach to this. I'm actually going to put the video in 3 different places because I'm finding that I'm not really getting a good, accurate reading on the video. So I'm going to try to do something a little bit different with that. And another thing that's different is it's Wednesday, and so I'm putting content out on a Wednesday as opposed to a Friday, and it's basically because of the logistics of my time. But to this book, I don't get anything from it, don't want anything from it. I simply want to share it with you because I think it's very insightful. And if you can integrate even part of these principles, I think it'll help. So anyway, there are 7 questions that Stanier gets into. And again, it takes more of a coaching approach to leadership, particularly. But like I said, I think you could figure out how to use this in lots of other ways. And so it goes through a series of, I guess, 7 questions. And so it starts out, and you can do a Google search, you can find the questions, but you need more than just the questions. I think the way he wraps it around and describes why these questions are effective and those kinds of things are useful. So that's something that I can't communicate here in a 10-minute video, but the book certainly communicates. But it's definitely worth the investment to purchase that book. Like I said, I'm not sure if I'm going to I have not gotten the other book yet, but I find it interesting. But anyway, so the first question is, when you first engage with someone, first things first is just asking them the question of what is on your mind. Essentially, that kind of opens the door to them telling you what's kind of forefront of their attention at that particular moment, right? Oftentimes when we meet with folks, we may have an agenda and those kinds of things, but sometimes we'll have unstructured. And I think this kind of approach works best when it's like a one-on-one. Like if you're having a one-on-one meeting with someone. I don't think this would work for a large. You could integrate some of these questions, I suppose, in a larger group setting, but specifically, I think they would be best when it's like a one-on-one kind of a situation. So if you have people that report directly to you, or people that you report directly to, and we all do, you could use these to some degree to structure conversations. But essentially, by asking the question, what is on your mind, you kind of get to the heart of what is focused on. And the second one, which is the one I like the best, and he gives different names for these things. I'm just giving you the questions. But asking the question, and what else? So the idea here is that usually when you ask somebody what is on their mind, usually the very first thing they come up with is really, I mean, it's kind of the forefront thing, but it may not be the bigger issue that they're wanting to address. I mean, and I was thinking and I forget where I learned this at or whatever, but um, oftentimes people hold back the most difficult thing that they need to address in a conversation until the very end. I forget where I heard this from. I picked it up in some book somewhere. I probably should have looked it up and figured out where I got it from. But essentially, it's kind of like when I'm meeting with people, and it's like, I've learned that oftentimes the first couple topics they talk about are really kind of surface, not really big and deep, not too not controversial. But when they get to the point of the conversation, they say, "Oh, and there's one last thing that I need to talk to you about." That's usually the most important thing that they wanted to talk about in the first place. And it's just kind of funny how human nature does that. And so one of the things you can do to be different is structure your conversation so the most important things are up front. I mean, if you're if you're driving the conversation, is put those things up front. And I think asking what is on your mind and what else kind of drives to get to that particular point. You let them get the surface stuff out, get the conversational get up, that is the conversational startup part, so that they get warmed up, if you will, and kind of get to the entry point of talking about what really matters. And then the third question would be, and what's the real challenge here for you? Now, Stanier breaks down why that question is so awesome, right? So, and I shouldn't use that word because he actually uses all for what and what else. But it's just it's a great question because it really focuses and hones in the person on what is the specific challenge. Then it goes on to ask what I would say is a fourth question. I think I talked about this in one of the other videos I talked about. What do you want? Oftentimes we don't stop and get to the point where we address what we want. To me, that's that's why the script on the awareness wheel or conflict communication wheel is step number 4 is so important, because it gets you to say what you want relative to behavior change. Here, you're getting the person to talk about the scenario, what's on your mind, and what else. You get them to the real issue. Then when you get them to the real issue, say, and what's the challenge here for you? And then you ask them, what do you want out of that situation, or what are you expecting? Then, and this is to me, this is key, because you'll notice that it's not until you get to the 5th question that you say, how can I help? As opposed to oftentimes we jump right into the trying to help from the beginning. And we really, when we jump to providing solutions to people from the get-go, we really rob them of the ability to develop as a leader. It kind of exudes some power over them, if you will, because it robs them of the ability to come to that solution or that conclusion themselves. I had the opportunity to work with an executive coach for many years, for about 4 or 5 years. And she was masterful at this, of kind of going through this process, this coaching process, and getting me to talk out things that were in there that I just had not put, things I hadn't connected, things that I hadn't put together, so forth. So that's kind of why this coaching approach is first. And the other thing I'll say is I'm not perfect. I'm trying to integrate this with my teams and do a better job of not letting my advice monster jump out. But it's hard. This is one of the hardest ones, I think, to integrate because you have to slow down and take the time to do it. And oftentimes we can feel like we don't have time. So, what's on your mind, and what else? What's the real challenge here for you? What do you want? How can I help? And then this is also a great question: is if you say yes to this, what are you saying no to? Would be the question that you would ask the person, right? So if they're going to do this, and we don't often talk about this, we typically just keep piling on stuff onto our life and that kind of thing. We never talk about what we need to let go to make room for something else in our life. And to me, this focuses on kind of uh, partially related to all the way back when I talked about developing habits, which I had gotten from his book. But oftentimes, if we try to subtract things from our life without adding something to take its place, we will struggle with breaking a habit or getting something out of our life. Right. So, one of the things that I've done is that, when my wife works nights. And so that's oftentimes one of the best times for me to integrate a positive habit that is exercising rather than sitting around and zoning out on Netflix or whatever and just wasting an evening. And so I've replaced the bad habit of just being a couch potato on the evenings that she works. She works 2 nights a week as a nurse, two 12-hour nights a week. And so those 2 nights, I try to do that. Now, I'm not always masterful at it, but essentially this idea of if you say yes to this, what are you saying no to? In other words, if you're adding this, what are you letting go of? And then the last question is more of a reflective, kind of like I would call it a metacognitive question. Um, because if you, and Stania goes into this, but long story short, it gets them to reflect on, and you're asking the question, what was the most useful thing for you in this conversation? Right. And it gets them to reflect on what are they walking away with? What is their takeaway here? And I think oftentimes we have conversations and we assume, and that's not to say that good things don't come from conversation, but oftentimes we don't stop and kind of take note of, okay, this is what I'm walking away with. And if you were if you were the person kind of driving this coaching conversation with these questions, and you were to tell them, they wouldn't integrate it. The person has to discover it on their own and integrate it on their own for it to be effective. So these are the 7 questions. I don't know if I got all of Stania's words right. All I can say is this is a great approach. It's a great script to kind of have in your pocket. I will say last week and I'll probably put it in the show notes again, I referred to the conversation between Brene Brown and Stania on a podcast. And it's really interesting to see how I provide you these 7 questions, but if you listen to kind of the interactive real-time dialogue that they have, because they have an unscripted dialogue focused on this, if you listen to that, you'll see that, Stanley's not like mechanistic about the way he goes this. So he may jump from question 1 to question 2 and then question 4. And it depends on the conversation. So I think part of using this, and I talked about this, I guess, last week when I was talking about using scripts, you have to be careful that you're not too formulaic with it, right? Because human beings kind of pick up on that, particularly if you repetitively use an approach like this with someone. And so essentially having these questions kind of I'm dating myself, a Rolodex in your mind, right? A flashcard in your mind, to be able to pull it out at appropriate points in the conversation. And to me, that's part of the skill of becoming a better coach, right? Of being able to know which question to ask when. Certainly asking that very first, I think the first 2 questions are pretty straightforward. I mean, that's probably how you're going to kick off the conversation in a lot of times. Or it may be somebody comes in and they immediately jump to what's on their mind. You don't even have to say that, so you don't have to use that cue. But nevertheless, being able to jump from one question to the other in a conversation, I think, is part of developing as a coach, part of developing as a leader, and it certainly takes some skill and some effort, and it's a really hard thing to do. But it's worth doing because you'll see your employees develop and flourish. And I think most leaders want to see the people that work with them and for them. You want to see them, go on and do greater things. Probably, go further, faster, higher than maybe you did, right? So that's this week's topic is the coaching habit. Again, I'd encourage you to pick up that book. It's a really good read, I think. And you'll get a lot more context. I'm kind of giving the short story here, the Cliff Notes version. And I don't think I think if anything, hopefully this leads you to that book. I think it's very valuable. So that is our third kind of set of scripts that I'm going to talk about. Next week, I want to talk about how to invite response or dialogue. And I think part of these I picked up from this men's group thing that I had worked on or been involved with a while ago called Warrior. Go back to the very first couple videos and I talk about that. But I noticed the primary person there, the guy, Garrett J. White, he would use these questions, but I also picked up some others from other places too. So I've kind of stitched together inviting response dialogue kinds of questions. And to me, this is useful for teaching, particularly. Because oftentimes we get up, we stand up, and we talk and that kind of thing, and we don't create space, and so it gives you a way to invite dialogue and response. I'll talk about that next week. I don't want to get too far ahead. So, with that, again, this is the Grad Connection. I'm Jamie Moeller. Hopefully, you're finding these videos useful. I do appreciate the comments, and whether you're on LinkedIn and you give me a thumbs up or whatever, if you're on Facebook and a thumbs up, or if you leave a comment on YouTube. Hopefully, you're finding them worthwhile. And I would encourage, again, if you're a graduate student, or even if even not, you're welcome to subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're connected with me on LinkedIn, I see a lot of you are viewing this content, which is great. And the numbers are growing there. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach this week, and I'm going to upload the video to all three places because I want to try to get a better record of who's viewing, because YouTube is not really giving me accurate records if you're coming through the LinkedIn door or the Facebook door. So, nevertheless, I'm going to try something different. Hopefully, find this useful. Have a great rest of your week. This is Hump Day, so, or at least for me, it is, depending on when you're watching this. But hopefully, you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.